This video is just for Game Masters, so if you're not a Game Master, you gotta leave. Right now, go, shoot. Okay, are they gone? Everyone here is a Game Master, right? Good. Today we'll be walking you through the basics of running Daggerheart as a Game Master, or GM, in today's Get Your Sheet Together. First and foremost, as the GM, you are the conductor or director of the world and story outside of the players, setting the mood and pace while providing conflict, mystery, and opportunity for them to act on. And you, as the world, react to their choices and roles accordingly. Beyond preparing or improvising an adventure with your players, one of your biggest tools to shape and facilitate the story is the GM move. Think of this as the GM taking their turn, briefly stepping into the spotlight to describe how the world and its denizens immediately act or react to the moment in a meaningful and impactful way. In safer environments, this can mean bringing in an opportunity for the players. In more dangerous scenarios, this can mean a dire change to the environment or the player's circumstances. In combat, this often means spotlighting an adversary to charge and attack your players. The outcome of a GM move is up to you, the GM, and what feels most logical and fun for the moment. After you've completed all GM moves you'd like to make, feel free to step back and let your players have the reins once more. Common times to consider making a GM move would be when a player rolls with fear, fails an action roll, takes an action that has consequences, or provides you a golden logical opportunity. Or sometimes the players might just look to you, the GM, for what happens next. Now, these are all prime examples of when to use a GM move. And you don't need to wait for a player's actions to make a GM move either. You can spend a fear to jump in and spice things up if the inspiration strikes, regardless of how well your players are rolling. Feel free to check out page 149 of the Daggerheart core rulebook for more details on GM moves. Also, not every GM move needs to be a game changer either. Sometimes the best consequences unfold way down the line when your players least expect it. So go ahead, let your players kill that Strix wolf. Its adorable babies will remember each and every one of their faces. An important skill for any GM to master is learning when to call for a roll. When determining whether or not a roll is necessary, consider a PC's experiences and narrative history. If someone is playing a bard, for example, with an experience like Pitch Perfect, you might decide they don't need to make a roll to sing well. They can just do it. But let's say this performance is tricky because the bard is trying to impress a particularly powerful crime boss. You might want to call for an action roll. Before calling for an action roll, there's a few things to consider. Offering success with a cost. It's pretty simple. Offer your player an automatic success for the low price of a messy consequence. For example, let's say your intrepid bard wants to pickpocket that crime boss from earlier. They could succeed without a roll, but the bartender would totally clock your bard's sticky fingers, and they might now try to blackmail you with this knowledge. Awkward and tense. Setting the stakes for your players. If the action is particularly risky or dramatic, spell out what success and failure looks like before the roll so your players know how much or how little is on the line. Let's go back to our bard trying to pickpocket a crime boss. On a success, their gambit goes unnoticed, but on a failure, they will likely get caught by the boss and will have to fight their way out of this club. And also clarifying guaranteed consequences. At some point, your players are going to take actions that will have fallout, no matter how high they roll. If that's the case, tell your players up front. For example, if you fight your way out of this club, you'll never be allowed back in. So now that you have an idea of how and when to call for action rolls, here's how to gauge the difficulty of those rolls. For a detailed breakdown on setting difficulties, check out page 158 and 159 of the Daggerheart core rulebook. But in broad strokes, difficulties in Daggerheart range from 5, a very easy task, to 15, an average challenge, to 30, nearly impossible. Now, the difficulty of a roll can be a secret, or you can reveal it to the player before they roll. There's no hard and fast rule on that in Daggerheart. Additionally, consider scaling results for your players based on how they roll, instead of simply giving a pass-fail binary. For instance, if your players are searching an area, you can give more or less info based on how high they roll. If they roll low, maybe they only discover a single fairly obscure clue. But if they roll really high, maybe they find the telltale clue that blows this case wide open. If your players are making an action roll against an adversary, they will be rolling against that adversary's difficulty. Speaking of adversaries, let's talk about fear, your primary resource. Like how the players collect hope, you collect fear. a fluid currency that allows you to ratchet up tension and sculpt dynamic challenges for your players. At the start of a campaign, you begin with an amount of fear equal to the number of players. You gain more whenever a player rolls with fear, during downtime, or through certain PC or adversary abilities. Your fear pool maxes out at 12 and carries over between sessions, so keep track. You can spend fear to do a number of things, but your bread and butter for these will be interrupting a player's action with a sudden twist, make an additional GM move, trigger a special adversary or environmental fear ability, or boost an adversary's roll with added experience. A fun trick is to keep your fear pool visible to your players at all times and let them watch it grow. If you collect a large amount of fear during combat after previously spending it freely, your players will know they're in for a tough fight. Which brings us to our next topic, running adversaries. Now, adversaries come preloaded with a bunch of cool abilities you can use in or out of combat. They can also do anything a player can do, from scaling walls to picking locks. While the players use 2d12 for their rolls, you are special, and instead you use a d20 GM die for your rolls. This makes your rolls a little more unpredictable, sometimes spectacular, sometimes tragic, while players have a more reliable bell curve with their 2d12s because, well, math. When you want an adversary to make an attack roll, roll your d20 and add the adversary's attack modifier. If they have advantage or disadvantage, roll an extra d20 and take the higher or lower result accordingly. And if you want to further increase odds in your favor, you can spend a fear to add any viable adversary experiences before the roll. If the roll meets or beats the player character's evasion, it hits! Now, while adversaries do make attack rolls, they don't typically make action rolls like player characters. They just get to act. If there's a question about whether or not they succeed, you might give a PC the opportunity to interfere before the action is complete. If an adversary is forced to make a reaction roll by the player, you roll a d20 against the set difficulty, spending fear to add any relevant bonuses, of course. Some adversary features call for players to make reaction rolls. For example, if an adversary has an earthquake spell that can knock PCs from their feet, making them vulnerable, that feature might call for an agility reaction roll. This gives the PCs an opportunity to react to the attack, often allowing them to reduce or negate the effect. But remember, reaction rolls don't generate hope or fear. And remember, keep fights dynamic. If an enemy is doomed, let them flee, surrender, or ask the players how they finish them off. You don't need to run every combat until every adversary is dead. Remember, you're telling a story, not killing boars in the woods for XP. Countdowns are a flavorful and practical lever for your GM to pull on when you need to track impending events, like an oncoming tidal wave or a siege engine breaching the walls of a fortress. First, you have to decide what specific event activates the countdown. Maybe it's closing a door, getting caught by a guard, or downing an important adversary. Next, you need to choose a die and set that starting value of the countdown. Then, you must decide what specific events or actions advance the countdown. This is pure GM fiat for you to figure out. For example, the countdown could advance any time your players roll with fear, or any time your players fail an action roll. And finally, you need to decide what effect resolves when the countdown ends. Maybe the enemy releases a devastating attack, or the walls of your precious castle come tumbling down. There are two types of countdowns to be aware of in Daggerheart: standard and dynamic. A standard countdown always ticks down when a player attacks or takes an action. A dynamic countdown advances based on the outcomes of rolls or choices, such as whether or not the team can spot the fleeing enemy and whether or not they pursue said enemy. And countdowns can be visible to your players or completely hidden. And you don't even need to disclose to your players that a countdown is taking place, let alone its specific triggers or outcomes. If you really want to ratchet the tension, you could spend fear to advance a longer countdown. Now for everyone's favorite topic, money! Well, specifically how Daggerheart handles wealth, equipment, and loot. Wealth is designed to be as important as you make it in Daggerheart. If you have a table full of crunchy survivalists, you can make gold vital for food and supplies. If you're going for a more classical, heroic fantasy vibe, you can hand-wave minor costs and focus on getting more of that sweet, sweet loot. Daggerheart measures wealth in handfuls, bags, and chests of coin. 10 handfuls equals 1 bag, 10 bags equals 1 chest, so on. And there's a handy table on page 165 of the Daggerheart core rulebook that breaks down the average cost of basic goods and services. However, don't be afraid to adjust these prices to reflect the economy of your world. And when it comes to loot, remember that rarity can be relative. What's common in one region might be priceless in another. Now that we have a feel for some of the mechanical elements of GMing Daggerheart, let's explore some GM best practices. First, cultivate curiosity at your table. Drop intriguing details, a muttered warning, a magical shimmer on a seemingly mundane object, or a distant but ominous thunderstorm on the horizon. See what details stick with your players and keep them guessing. If your players totally ignore the obvious plot hook and get hung up on an unimportant detail, guess what? Maybe that unimportant detail just became your new plot hook. Rewarding your players' curiosity with story progression not only advances the story faster, it also helps foster trust, which leads us to our next GM best practice. Earn your players' trust and maintain it. Since many mechanics in Daggerheart are rooted in the good faith of players and their GMs, trust is an essential part of this game, and frankly, any tabletop RPG for that matter. Follow through on clues, consequences, and expectations. If you promise danger in the basement, there better be a werewolf or something down there. Or at least a gas leak. And finally, cut to the action. You can skip uneventful travel if you'd like. 2 days pass and you reach the city gates without any complications along the way. Focus on getting to the parts of the story where there's, well, story. There are actually quite a few useful GM best practices on page 144 of the Daggerheart core rulebook. And if you're interested in GMing, get familiar with them. We've covered the basic mechanics and ideas behind GMing Daggerheart. So now, go! GM a story! You probably let your players back in now, I guess.
Get your sheet together.